Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on the formation of a protest movement. In this conversation, we are going to look at the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. We're going to look at Rosa Parks and what happened with her on a Montgomery bus, and then we're going to look at the development of the boycott itself. And then we're going to look at resistance to the boycott. And then we're going to look at the long-term effects of the Montgomery bus boycott, the development of the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., the creation of an organization that was extremely important in the civil rights movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then how resistance was galvanized by the Montgomery bus boycott. And that essentially by the late 1950s, we see sort of what we call the high tide of white resistance. So I want to begin by asking the question, why a boycott? Why would black citizens of Montgomery boycott the buses? Why would they see that as an effective means of protest? Why would there be a need in the first place to take a stand like this? I think it's important to understand there are people that rely on bus transportation, and they were allowed to access it, but in a way that was not equal with other citizens of Montgomery. And so why a boycott? Martin Luther King Jr., in his speech at the evening rally of December 5th, 1955, at the kind of formation stage of the boycott, said this, love must be our regulating ideal. If you will protest courageously and yet with dignity and Christian love, when the history books are written in future generations, the historians will have to pause and say, there lived a great people, a black people, who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. This is our challenge and our overwhelming responsibility. So in this statement, Martin Luther King sort of laid the groundwork for the philosophy and the strategy of the civil rights movement, which was to, and I like what he said here, there lived a great people, a black people. I mean, one of the problems with segregation is that it assumes that one group of people is better than another, and it also assumes that people cannot interact with each other freely and equally because of their race. And so King is saying, we are going to stand up and we're going to protest courageously and yet with dignity and Christian love, so that the future will be different, so that people will look back and say, we were able to forge a new path, something different, something better. So why boycott? It is a much broader answer to that question. It's not just about buses. In the practical sense, it's about buses, but it is about basic human dignity. It is about the challenges of creating a society that's free and equal. So Mrs. Rosa Parks is the obviously enormously important figure in the Montgomery bus boycott. On December 1st, 1955, she boarded a bus in the city. And from there, everything kind of spiraled. And the background of that date is that in the month before, in November of 1955, the Interstate Commerce Commission, a federal agency, had banned segregation in all facilities and vehicles involved in interstate transportation. So the Constitution gives the federal government power to regulate interstate commerce or trade or things that go on in between states. And For this reason, the federal organization or agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, said we're going to ban segregation in all the facilities and vehicles involved in interstate transportation. Now, obviously, that raises a lot of questions. Are you talking about buses that go from one state to another? Well, what about Montgomery, where you have these buses that stay within the city of Montgomery, and they don't necessarily go from state to state? So there's going to be lots of questions about that. Rosa Parks and her action is going to question how broad that decision is, and does that decision include local bus companies like the company in Montgomery. Parks herself was a 42-year-old seamstress. She was married. She was the secretary of the local NAACP, and she boarded the bus. And when she was asked to give up her seat by a white person, she refused. And for that, she was arrested. Now, why would somebody be arrested for something like this? Well, the policy for the Montgomery buses was that a black person would enter at the front door of the bus. And I really want you, I have this picture of the bus here because I want you to think about this. The black citizen would enter the front door of the bus, pay the driver the fare, and then would have to exit the bus and enter the back door of the bus and sit or stand in the back of the bus. Whenever a white person got on the bus and there were not enough seats in the white section, the white person could go to where the black citizen was seated and ask them or demand that they stand so that they could sit. And I just think it's very sobering to see the reality of the depth of this policy and how dishonoring it is to human beings to treat them this way based on their race or really any other reason. And so that was the bus policy. And so Rosa Parks, when she did not give up her seat, violated the bus policy and was, as a result, arrested and charged with a crime. So that occurred on December 1st, 1955. Immediately, word spread about what was going on. E.D. Nixon, a Montgomery citizen, president of the Alabama NAACP, and Joanne Robinson, another citizen of Montgomery, who was the head of the local women's political council. These two of them were both involved in civil rights activities. They got together and had a conversation and decided that this would be a really good test case for what we talked about with the Interstate Commerce Commission, and that parks would be the perfect symbol of protest for this bus issue. Parks was a very, very well respected person within the community, and they thought this is the ideal moment to try to address these issues. And so they agreed that they would try to get together a one-day boycott on December 5th, 1955, which was the same day as Rosa Parks' trial for her violation of the bus policy. And so that was scheduled for December 5th, 1955, with regard to Nixon and Robinson. So they then brought together at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church the next day a meeting of local ministers and asked them to preach sermons. They agreed to kind of organize black taxis to take black citizens to their jobs, because obviously one of the reasons there is transportation like this is because people don't have their own vehicles. So they arranged for Black citizens to use their cars as taxis, and they agreed to have a meeting, and they agreed to pass out leaflets. So that occurred on Sunday, December 4th. There were pastors who preached sermons, and there were leaflets distributed for the boycott. And on Monday, December 5th, the boycott occurred. And thousands of Montgomery Black citizens stayed off of the local buses. Um, Parks's trial resulted in a guilty verdict, and afterwards, um, E.D. Nixon met with ministers on the steps of the courthouse, and they agreed that uh, they should create some sort of organization moving forward. Uh, the ministers met at Mount Zion AME Church in the afternoon and decided to form the Montgomery Improvement Association. And they essentially agreed that what they were going to do was advocate that the bus company hire some black bus drivers, that the black citizens be treated with courtesy, and that seating be first come, first served, and it just be a simple policy that would be normal in a normal world, quite frankly. One of the things you have to realize is, why would they say hire black bus drivers? Well, the Montgomery bus drivers, many of them were just vicious and would do horrible things like take the fare of a black person, and then when they were walking to the back, actually drive the bus away to humiliate them and embarrass them. And so there was lots of mistreatment. And just, I mean, obviously, if you have a system like this and you accept that this is a good idea, obviously you're going to have people be abusive, and that was occurring within the system. Probably the biggest decision that was made for the future with regard to the Montgomery bus boycott was the decision to ask Martin Luther King Jr. to be the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Um, E.D. Nixon recommended King to lead the organization. King had grown up in Atlanta. His father was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, a very, very prestigious black church in the city. And he had come to Montgomery fairly recently to be the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Uh, King had attended Morehouse College, Crozer Theological Seminary. He had graduated from Boston University. He had married, as you can see pictured here, is King and his wife, Coretta Scott King. And Martin Luther King Jr. was certainly a voice, as we will see, for nonviolent, passive resistance to laws. So he is a civil disobedience advocate, but nonviolent, and so we know that he was an avid reader of the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau. So on December 5th, 1955, um, at Holt Street Baptist Church, there was the evening rally. So this is after Parks is found guilty. This is the first day of the boycott, and there is an evening rally that afternoon. As we know, Martin Luther King Jr., pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, was asked to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association. And that night, King made the speech that sort of launched his civil rights career, in which he made the statement that we included in an answer to our first question. on where he sets up, and this speech is just an absolutely amazing speech. I don't even have any idea how he could have put such a speech together in just a few hours. But the room, as you can see from the picture, was packed with black citizens, and and King is going to demonstrate um, very quickly that he is uh, an incredibly articulate and thoughtful leader. He has power of persuasion. He is gifted as a writer and a thinker, and he's able to articulate his ideas in a way that will connect with not only, and this is so important, not only with Black Americans, but with white Americans ultimately. And that's extremely important to this movement. And so in this rally, King plots out the foundation of his protest ideology, which is to be Christian, to be nonviolent, to be an example of love uh, and Christian goodness and kindness, but to also stand up for yourself and say, this is not acceptable to us. So to make your voice known, but in the right way, in the way that Jesus taught us to speak and act. And that is the theme, and that's the core. And you can certainly see that throughout this speech. So that's the boycott itself, and the decision that's going to be made with regard to all of this is to continue boycotting essentially. Once they get past December 5th, the agreement is that we are just going to stay off these buses, and that's what King's going to talk about in his speech. That's what the Montgomery Improvement Association is going to be all about, that we are not going to stop boycotting these buses until we are permitted to have the same basic rights as white citizens. So the question I have then as we look at the resistance to this movement is, how exactly do you resist a pastor-led, peaceful bus boycott? I mean, this is really a fascinating moment in history where people who have every reason in the world to riot and burn down buildings and do all kinds of other things and respond badly to a bad situation. Here you have a situation in which the pastors, the churches, have decided we're going to use the teaching of Jesus and we're going to peacefully boycott the buses. We're not going to do anything else except just not ride on the bus in order that people will see that we're serious and that we want the same rights as other people. How do you resist something like that? How do you deal with a movement like that? And King was smart. He knew that it'd be very difficult to resist or to come against a movement such as this. So how do you do that? Well, after his house was bombed, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s house was bombed, um, Martin Luther King stepped out onto the porch of his house. A black mob had gathered there, and they were incredibly angry, and they wanted revenge. And he stepped out onto his porch and he said, "Don't get panicky. Get rid of your weapons. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us." And so when you think of that question, how do you resist something like this? The truth is, you can't really resist something like this boycott and the way it was structured without doing something really, really wrong. Like you're going to be on the morally wrong side of this no matter what you do. And so often when people are on the morally wrong side, they do immoral things. And so there's going to be the bombing of King's house. but they're also going to work really hard to find some sort of justification, to find some way to legitimize their actions. You're going to really have both of those elements. You're going to have the immoral violence, but then you're also going to have the arguments that are going to be made to attempt to justify segregation. And we've already walked through many of those arguments. So the resistance itself involved a lot of different levels. The mayor of the city, W.A. Gale, challenged the legality of carpools. He said that, they did things like saying that you don't have a license to run a taxi and all kinds of legal maneuvers that they tried to use to come against people who were picking up other people and taking them to work, basically. Um, the city kind of created a get tough policy of harassment of black leaders. King himself, you see pictured here, was arrested for speeding. So the black taxi cabs, they would see people taking people in cars and they would arrest them and they would claim they were speeding or they'd run stop signs or whatever. So the mechanism of law enforcement came very aggressively against those who were part of this boycott. And obviously the police mechanism, the law enforcement mechanism was in the hands of the white citizens of Montgomery. And as we mentioned a minute ago, part of the bombing, part of the resistance to the bus boycott was that Martin Luther King's house was bombed. And this is a picture of him addressing the crowd from his porch, saying, "Love your enemies." Later, King was indicted for hindering businesses without a just cause, basically saying that he was hurting the bus company without a good reason. And we should understand that King himself is going to come, he is stepping into a place that is intensely controversial. And he is going to get attacked from all sides. And one of the surprising lines of attack comes from Reverend Robert H. Jackson, who was the president of the National Baptist Convention. He was probably the most prominent black pastor in America at that time. He was pastor of a church in Chicago, I believe. And Robert H. Jackson, he called Martin Luther King a hoodlum. He said, "This is not what we need. These kind of activities just disrupt the thing." He wasn't arguing that segregation is okay, but he came firmly against any kind of civil disobedience, any kind of disruption. But that's the interesting thing with the Montgomery bus boycott. Is this really even civil disobedience? This is people just not riding the bus. That's different than some of the later protests that we're going to see. But in this one itself, can you even make an argument that this is civil disobedience? Which is, a really interesting question. Just the simple act of refusing to ride a bus. Ultimately, this bus boycott is going to last over a year. And ultimately, what's going to happen is the Supreme Court is going to uphold a lower court decision that said that the bus policy violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment lays out the idea, as we have seen, that anyone born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen of the United States, and they're citizens of the state that they live in, and they are guaranteed equal protection of the law like any other citizen. And so King and others in December of 1956, the following year, celebrated that decision by getting on the bus and riding the buses wherever they wanted to sit front and back. And you see this as King is pictured here riding on in the front of the bus. So that brings us to the third part of our conversation, um, which is the long-term effects of this. And one of the long-term effects is going to be the sort of galvanizing of resistance. And it is a very interesting fact that what is going to happen is you're going to see, um, and I kind of mentioned this earlier in this conversation, you're going to see this idea that the protesters, the civil rights leaders, are communists. So I asked the question, why accuse civil rights leaders of communism? And I think to understand that, you have to understand that this period of time is a time in which there are, it's the second Red Scare in the 1950s. The rise of communism in Russia is dated to 1917. By this time, and all ever since communism took over, ever since the communists took over Russia, um, that sparked a fear in America that the same thing would happen here. And there was a fear that the workers were going to unite with each other and decide to overthrow our capitalist system, our free market economy, and take control like had happened in Russia. There's also the element of communism which abolishes religion and private property and all that sort of thing. And so it does have all of these elements that are very contrary to American thinking. At the same time, you also have, since the 1930s, the rise of unions in America. And so you have workers organizing in unions, and a lot of times people would say, well, they're communists. And so there's a lot of conflation of things, I guess, is what I want to say to you. In the 1950s, we're now in the Cold War era, where it's become very clear that Russia is our enemy and communism is our enemy. So you have that playing in. You have McCarthyism and Eugene McCarthy arguing that there's all kinds of communists that have infiltrated our government and that kind of thing. And so there's all this surrounding issue. And so those who, and there were some civil rights leaders who were sympathetic to socialism. That's a different thing than communism, but it is used by communists. Um, and you have, so all of those things kind of working together to create this conflation of ideas. So why communism? Because it was part of the thinking of that era. And anybody you disagreed with and was a threat to you, the most harmful thing you could do to them was say that they were a communist. So at the same time that you have the bus boycott going on in Montgomery, um, obviously we know about school desegregation issues going on throughout the country. There was also a situation in Louisville, Kentucky, in which a black citizen had purchased a house in a white neighborhood and had tried to, come against the housing segregation issues that existed in our country. And so John Y. Hitt, who was a newspaper reporter for the local Shively Newsweek, he wrote an article in the paper, and this is what he said. The cause of non-segregation, or is it the cause which made Stalin the Lion of Russia? Or could it be the cause of the communists in this country to encourage panic, chaos, and plot to lower the morale of the American people? I think it's really important to understand that we're going to see people start to frame this conversation in a totally different way now. And that's very important because what I talked about earlier, how do you resist a pastor-led, peaceful, uh, following the teachings of Jesus bus boycott? How do you do that? How do you resist a black man simply wanting to own a house in a white neighborhood? How do you come against these sorts of things? And one of the ways is that you develop a new sort of philosophy that makes this person sinister, enemy, un-American, somebody that's trying to cause panic, chaos, and do something harmful to America. And so this is a great example of an interjection of that kind of thinking into our conversation. Another Louisville, Kentucky resident, Millard D. Grubbs, wrote an editorial, and he said, today, not only in America but throughout the world, the white people are hemmed in and surrounded by colored people. We live literally in a sea of color, the only chance or hope for the survival of the white race in a world's population which outnumber it 10 to 1 is adherence to a strict line of segregation. The Marxist world plotters well know that non-segregation leads to miscegenation and racial mixture. So here we go even deeper into the conversation, and again, thinking about issues like racial purity, and basically saying that it's the communists and the civil rights leaders who are working together to destroy the white race and to destroy America. And so these are outside plotters recognizing that the best way to destroy America would be miscegenation and racial mixture. And again, this quote is in response simply to a black family moving into a white neighborhood. But you have to understand the underpinnings of the ideas of segregation, of why would you create two separate societies? Why would you limit people's contact? When you really, why would you limit the contact of the races with each other? When you really get down to it, it is at its most deepest depth. It is an issue of racial mixture, and it is an issue of racial purity. And you see that here, and drawing communism into that whole conversation. So the long-term effects of the Montgomery bus boycott, the formation of this movement, is going to be, first of all, the creation of a national leader, Martin Luther King, and a strategy of nonviolence to go along with that. King developed a list of 17 rules, essentially, of engagement. And those rules were really intended to do two things: weaken the white community, to kind of sort of undermine their resolve. Like, if you see black people protesting peacefully, singing hymns, praying, and you see white law enforcement or white mobs throwing bottles at them, or spitting on them, or cursing at them, that has an effect. That weakens the resolve of the white community. So he wanted to accomplish that. He also wanted to energize the black community. He wanted to inject energy, because one of the problems King's going to have is getting black citizens to protest, because passivity, and something that we get very confused about, for the 100 years after um, the end of slavery, passivity is the norm in the black community. Just going along with things the way they are and not protesting is much more normal and much more frequent than anything else. No matter how violent the white community gets towards black citizens, passivity was the norm. And so he wanted to energize the black community. And so he developed several really important themes. One was that suffering is redemptive, that there is a redemptive value in suffering, that Jesus suffered. And so when we suffer in society, we are suffering the way Jesus did. And there's an identity with the suffering of Jesus, that he understands what we're going through, that we understand a little of what he went through. And so there is that redemptive nature of suffering. And so he wanted to bring that into the conversation. He also, in connection with that, wanted to amplify the self-esteem of Black Americans, that that you are God's creation. You bear the image of God just like anyone else. and you should be treated like everyone else in society. And so to develop those themes of self-respect and self-esteem that we saw in the Black Renaissance of the 1920s a little further is something that King is going to be important in doing. And then thirdly, he is going to create unity within the Black community around a larger movement. Instead of looking at everything as individual, we're going to look at this in the context of the larger Black community. And we're going to say, let's create a movement, a larger movement that we can unify around. And so citizens of Montgomery will come alongside of citizens in Selma and citizens in Birmingham and ultimately in Louisville, Kentucky. And so that is King's vision. That is King's leadership. And that is sort of the new strategy of nonviolence and how that will work its way out. We're going to take the higher road. And that all of that is going to play into the idea of suffering being redemptive and amplifying Black self-esteem and unifying Blacks around a larger movement that has a good purpose, a biblical purpose, a purpose that is moral and good. The second thing we get as a long-term effect of this Montgomery bus boycott and the formation of a protest movement is the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You see King and his wife Coretta leading a march here in the front. And this organization is created in January of 1957. And it is really an organization that is going to bring together the resources of the Southern Black Church into a civil rights organization. And it's kind of going to seek to lift the Black Church out of its passivity and to get it to, again, not to become violent, and not to become, excessive, but to use the theology of the Black Church, use the idea of redemptive suffering and self-esteem and say, we are going to go out there and we are going to protest for the same rights that everybody else has in society. And so the Southern Black Church is going to really be kind of the foundation of the civil rights movement that Martin Luther King, for the part of it that Martin Luther King leads. And so there's several things that are really important about that. The Black Church is going to provide a huge base of supporters for the movement. It is going to provide a leadership that's economically independent of whites. The Black Church had its own structure. It was segregated, as we know, and so it has a leadership that are able to exist. They're not going to lose their jobs because they're not employed by white people or white companies. It's a Black organization with Black leaders funded by Black Americans. It's a communication network, an incredible communication network throughout the South. The Black Church has money. It's a place to meet for meetings and organization anywhere and in any city, in any town. And the Black Church provided a language that was understood by all Black Christians. It provided not just a communication network, but a language that could be used to make people aware of what was going on and bring them and persuade them to be part of it. It also provided music that's going to be very, very important to the civil rights movement. And it's also, and very importantly, going to provide religious sanction. It's going to provide sort of a stamp of approval of we are on the right path. And so the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a very, very important long-term effect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And then lastly, part of what's going on in Montgomery in 1955 and in Louisville with regard to housing and other parts of the South, and what's going on with regard to school desegregation, all of these things are going to lead us into what we call the high tide of resistance. The late 1950s, especially, are a moment in time in which white Southerners are going to sort of make their last stand. And again, I remind you of, and just to show you again how prevalent this thinking still is in America. You see the American flag and the Confederate flag in our picture side by side. The citizens' councils, these were white citizens' councils, arguing for states' rights, racial integrity, that's another word for racial purity, keeping the races separate so that we have a black race and a white race, not mixing them together. And these organizations are going to, many of them already existed, they're going to gain new membership, and they're going to become very, very aggressive in the middle to late 1950s and beyond, but especially in the 50s. And so examples of things that occurred. Autherine Lucy, a black female student at the University of Alabama, who the court said Alabama had to put in there, so they did, and then they expelled her. The University of Alabama expelled her. As we have seen, Little Rock closed all its schools down. Virginia closed its public schools in order to keep black and white students from going to school together. The white citizens councils, as I said, gained strength and membership. There were bombings. There's a violent aspect to this. There are bombings throughout the country, cross burnings. The KKK obviously is involved. Violence against peaceful protesters. Very, very common theme of this era. And then there's the communism element. There's this idea that outside influences and disruptions there's outside influences coming in here trying to disrupt us, and that ultimately the goal was miscegenation. It's the disappearance of the white race completely. One of the probably the most prominent evangelical leader of the period, the revivalist Billy Graham. He is someone that was sort of a moderate on the issue of segregation. He very famously took down the segregation rope lines in one of his rallies. He was going throughout cities doing rallies in stadiums and other places like that, religious meetings, and he took down the rope lines and said, people are going to be able to sit together in my rallies. And that was a huge thing for him. But it's sort of a mixed bag with Graham. He also then avoided scheduling meetings in towns where segregation was a really big issue. And the other thing that makes Graham, and he's not going to really jump on board as a big supporter of Martin Luther King. He's not going to be out on the front of this. And the other thing is going to mix together is Graham is going to be a very, very big anti-communist advocate. And so he's going to be talking in his rallies very often about the threat of communism, godless communism, as he called it, and it is godless. And he's going to not necessarily make connections between godless communism and the civil rights movement, but he's going to add to that fervor within the white community and that fear that existed within the white community of communist subversion. And so other people will then maybe connect the dots to what Graham was saying, and I don't think Graham was trying to connect the dots himself. But that's the atmosphere. That's the religious atmosphere. That's the leadership that we have. And again, don't forget that you have Robert Jackson, the pastor, the black pastor from Chicago, taking a stance against Martin Luther King, probably more aggressively against Martin Luther King than Graham ever was. And so you're going to have this very confusing element, but together, the white resistance is going to use these disparate. Look, there's a black pastor that says King's a hoodlum. Look, Graham is telling us that communism is a real thing. So blending that all together is going to be an important element of the fueling of the white resistance movement. Then you have this response of the black community within the civil rights movement. You're going to have a new and different kind of response. Robert Williams is going to be advocating, he's a black leader that's going to advocate black gun clubs. The idea is we need to arm black citizens to protect ourselves against the violence that's occurring. Then you're going to have Malcolm X, who we're going to talk about later, come into the conversation as well and start to talk about some of his ideas about a more aggressive black response to what's going on. And then late in the decade, you have a documentary produced by, I believe, CBS News called The Hate That Hate Produced, that's going to look at Malcolm X and is going to look at how the hate of whites against blacks is going to produce hate of within the black community against the white community. And that's going to be something that's going to even further fuel the kind of fear of the civil rights movement and what's going on. And so it's very important to understand the fear that underlies all of this. The fear that the black community is going to turn violent, the fear of communism, the fear of miscegenation, and the white race losing their identity, the fear of losing control of the system, and all these different elements are playing together. This is a rough time in America for white people. I'm not sympathetic to their situation, but I am saying that it is a very difficult thing for them to navigate. And so they're going to come up with a lot of bad answers to a lot of very difficult questions that they're facing. So in this conversation on the formation of a protest movement, we've looked at the boycott at Rosa Parks and the formation of a boycott in Montgomery. We've looked at resistance in Montgomery to that boycott. And then we've looked at these critical long-term effects, the creation of a national leader, Martin Luther King, and a strategy. We've looked at the new organization of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, kind of uniting the black church together in the civil rights movement, and then the galvanizing of resistance, the high tide of white resistance that these events ultimately provoked. Some takeaways from this conversation. Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man and was arrested, found guilty, and in response, blacks boycotted the buses for more than a year. Martin Luther King, as the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and head of the Montgomery Improvement Association, became the leader of the protest movement. He advocated a strategy of peaceful, nonviolent protest. Whites resisted the boycott aggressively, and the federal courts ruled against bus segregation on the basis that it violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. Some questions to consider. What are the moral implications of civil disobedience? Describe the biblical foundations of King's speech after his house was bombed. Describe the relationship between Christianity, the civil rights movement, and communism. Thanks for joining the conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.